The last French battleship to be completed, and indeed the last battleship to be completed in general, Jean Bart would see an underwhelming career in a lot of ways. Her wartime service largely consisted of sitting in port, though she would be one of the few cases of a ship to fight a gunnery duel at anchor. Certainly a special case in that she did so while incomplete and with only one main battery turret actually functional. Damaged at her moorings, she would not contribute at all other than training duties for the remainder of the Second World War. That being said, the path she took to reach her North African port of call was an interesting one. A tale of ingenuity and stubborn determination, let down by the inability to complete her upon arrival. If she had a short operational career, well, she's still worth taking a look at. A look entirely apart from her, admittedly more successful, sister ship. On that note, and with forewarning that my French pronunciations are terrible, Jean Bart was the second of the Richelieu-class battleships. These were the second treaty battleships designed and built for the French Navy, and were, arguably, one of the best of the type. Certainly superior in every metric to their predecessors in the Dunkirks, which were far smaller battleships. In light of this fact, the ships were built to the ragged edge of treaty compliance, as the French were still holding to the Washington Treaty at this point. In addition to having relatively small dockyards, but that's another issue entirely. Displacing about 37,000 tons standard, the resulting design was, admittedly a tad overweight, but certainly not outright treaty busting like the Littorios. On this displacement, the French fit 8 380mm guns, 15-inch for the American audience. To make their best swing at being treaty compliant, these were laid out the same as Dunkirk, with 2 quad turrets mounted ahead of the superstructure. The secondary battery was intended to be 12 100mm anti-aircraft guns, supporting 9 152mm 6-inch anti-surface guns, 8 37mm anti-aircraft guns, and a smattering of machine guns rounded that out. Armor protection was fairly heavy at 330mm 13 inches on the main belt, with a deck of 170mm 6.7 inches. Intended for 32 knots, though capable of a little more on trials, the ship was also fairly fast. Now, with that out of the way, I'll leave a more detailed discussion on the design process for Richelieu herself. This video is about Jean Bart, so the remainder will largely focus on her own construction, much delayed as that was, and her service history. Initially laid down on December 12, 1936, Jean Bart would have a slow start to construction. She wouldn't be launched until March 6, 1940, almost 4 years later. If you know your World War II history, you'll note that this is when Germany was about to start kicking France's teeth in. It should be a little surprised, then, that her construction past this point was something of a rush job. When the Germans began to really knock the French around in the Battle of France, come May, the French began to try to complete the ship enough to at least set sail. In lieu of a normal fitting out process, the builders focused entirely on her propulsion system. In this, they were able to get 3 of her boilers, 2 of her turbines, 2 generators, and 2 pumps installed and working. And all of that within a month. Couple this with getting the outer shafts installed on June 6th and June 7th, and then testing her boilers on June 12th, Jean Bart was, well, she was at least capable of moving under her own power. Once her anchors and rudders were installed, along with her hull being properly sealed, she was ready to sail. Without anything but her foremost main battery turret actually armed, but still. Her super firing turret, for its part, was very technically installed, but lacked guns or armor, and none of her secondaries were installed at all. When it came time to sail, she had to steal a pair of twin 90mm guns from another ship in place of her 100mm guns, while 3 of the 37mm guns and a measly 6 machine guns were installed for anti-aircraft work. Those would be the only functional guns when she fled France, because even the complete turret lacked shell handling or fire control systems. So, as such, when orders came down to evacuate as soon as possible on June 11th, Jean Bart had a single equipped, but non-functional, main battery turret, some stolen 90mm guns, and a handful of anti-aircraft weapons. Not a stellar equipment layout, but for the purposes of running away to avoid capture by Panzer divisions, well, it worked well enough. And move she would on June 19th, being towed out into a hastily dug channel, where she promptly grounded because the work had been so rushed, that it wasn't properly done. That bent one of her propeller blades, but with the tugs pulling her free, Jean Bart was able to get her own engine started and out of the harbor. This in spite of 3 German Heinkels attacking and landing a single, small bomb between her turrets. During her flight to North Africa, the British evidently showed up to offer to tow her to Britain. Apparently, they were already trying to steal the French fleet to keep it out of Axis hands. In any case, Jean Bart managed an impressive, considering her incomplete state and bent propeller, speed of 24 knots on her journey to Africa, arriving in Casablanca on June 22nd, whereupon her control would pass to Vichy, France, though they didn't do much with it. They couldn't do much with it, under both German treaty restrictions and with the plain lack of infrastructure or trained workers in Morocco. Docked in Casablanca, construction would proceed slowly on Jean Bart, while the majority of her anti-aircraft guns were removed to strengthen the harbor defenses. While treaty negotiations would have seen Jean Bart and her sister sent to Toulon for demobilization, they ended up remaining in Africa out of a fear the British would try to seize them when they moved. For their part, the British ended up bombarding the other French ships in their African colonies out of the belief the Germans would seize them. That resulted in Jean Bart having her secondary turret barbettes sealed with concrete and her hull moved to shallow water in the event she was also attacked. Various attempts at making her somewhat combat capable followed, such as hacking together a gunfire director by mounting a 14-meter rangefinder atop a torpedo tube platform pulled off an old destroyer. A further smattering of machine guns were mounted in place of her actually useful anti-aircraft guns as well, though those would eventually receive some support in 1942 in replacement 37mm and 90mm guns. Over the course of that year, other guns would be installed, and her single functional main battery turret would be brought into full service by May, albeit that the hack job gun director apparently failed in practice, and her fire had to be guided by observers ashore. More 37mm and 90mm guns were fitted, though these were still less effective or numerous than what she was initially intended to carry. The French even managed to dig up a radar set, which is impressive, though questionable on a ship that couldn't sail properly. By November of 1942, then, she carried 4 functional 380mm guns, 5 twin 90mm mounts for a total of 10 guns, a further 5 37mm guns, 2 twin turrets and 1 single mount, the assorted machine guns, and a radar that may or may not have worked properly. In strictest terms, then, she was capable of fighting and defending herself. Not particularly well, but still technically combat capable. Of course, in November, we reach Operation Torch. The Anglo-American invasion of North Africa would see Jean Bart's only real combat action. Sitting at her dock, she traded salvos with the similarly new battleship USS Massachusetts on November 8th, after being bombed by USS Ranger, that is. That bombing did relatively minor damage. The same could not be said when she traded shots with the American battleship. While Jean Bart's fire would do no substantial damage, the return fire would do at least decent damage to her in turn. 1 American shell penetrated her deck armor and exploded in the magazines for her missing 152mm guns. Fortunate for her that the magazine was empty, or she might well have blown up there. That shell was the only one that really put her at risk of sinking, though the others did do some damage in their own right. They either hit near her and deformed her plating, or exploded against the armor. One managed to hit the turret face of her operational turret, temporarily damaging the guns. The rest of the hits mostly just caused flooding, though nothing too severe. With a good amount of her main battery shells expended, and Jean Bart apparently out of action, Massachusetts ceased fire and saved the rest of her ammunition for the off chance that Richelieu sortied against her. As it would turn out, that didn't happen, and Jean Bart was not actually out of action. The French cut away the damaged armor and got her main guns back in action, opening fire again on November 10th. This time she engaged the heavy cruiser USS Augusta, landing hits close enough to make the cruiser withdraw. As it was now apparent that the French battleship was still a threat, if only as a floating battery, Ranger attacked her once more. This time, the bombers were carrying much heavier bombs. The Dauntlesses scored 2 hits with 1,000-pound bombs, crippling Jean Bart. One punched through her bow and caused severe damage and flooding. Another punched through her stern, destroying a fairly hefty chunk of her hull. Between the fires and flooding caused by those hits, Jean Bart was left mostly without power and stuck at her moorings. And yet, even for all of that, her guns were still operational, or would have been had they had any power to be moved. However, with the French surrender in North Africa, Jean Bart passed from Vichy to free French control. At this point, both damaged and still incomplete, there were various plans put forward to fix her up and commission the ship. Such things as replacing her main battery guns with the antique 343mm guns from the old Lorraine, since Jean Bart's guns had to be taken off to re-equip her sister. I'm admittedly uncertain how they plan to do that, considering the amount of work it would require to redesign the turret to mount the smaller guns. The more realistic, though still somewhat crazy to think about, rebuilds consisted of turning her into USS Second Amendment. Okay, joking aside, there were two variations intended to refit Jean Bart as an anti-aircraft battleship. These involved replacing her super-firing main turret and secondary battery with between 15 to 17 dual 5-inch 38 caliber mounts. Or if you prefer it this way, 30 to 34 5-inch guns. Where the French were going to get those, when the British couldn't even get any for far less impressive cruiser rebuilds, I'm not sure. But imagining the amount of fire that version of Jean Bart could put in the air is vaguely terrifying. Especially when one takes into account, the French also wanted to put 50 20mm cannon and up to 80 40mm Bofors and 20 quad mounts aboard the ship. Just for comparison's sake, an Iowa would have 20 5-inch guns and something like 50 20mm and 80 40mm guns on her own. As it is, none of these ideas would come to pass though, nor would a harebrained battle carrier, or a more reasonable full carrier, conversion. The French had nowhere near the resources to pull a rebuild off, and the United States, already somewhat annoyed at having to refit her sister, basically said, no, we have enough battleships, and our industry is already busy enough as it is. Toss in the fact that completing her would require a bunch of non-standard components that the US would have to create tooling just to build. It's easy to understand why it was denied. Regardless, the French persevered as they had under Vichy control. Enough repairs were completed to run sea trials, where in spite of having a deformed hull, Jean Bart managed 22.5 knots. This would allow her to function as a training ship for the remainder of the war, but nothing more than that. While her sister was fighting in the Pacific, Jean Bart languished around Morocco. After the war ended and France was finally able to complete the ship on their own, various proposals cropped up again. A return to a carrier conversion was rejected, as the ship would have only been able to carry about 40 aircraft, which was subpar even compared to British armored carriers by this point. A second plan would have seen her scrapped entirely, and the Navy focusing on more reasonable construction projects. Which, sad as it is to say, was probably the best use of France's limited resources. In the end, though, Jean Bart would be completed, more or less to her original design, albeit with a far heavier anti-aircraft battery and some changes to her superstructure. This work would proceed fairly slowly, as lingering damage was repaired, and the French had to completely rebuild her turrets and guns. It would only be in 1949 that she entered service, still technically incomplete as she lacked any anti-aircraft guns. She would remain in that state until July 1951, when she entered back into dock for the rest of the modernization work. This would see her secondary battery turrets modified to become dual-purpose, and her new battery of 12 100mm and 28 57mm guns fitted. The work would end up being about as slow as everything else involving her construction. Jean Bart wouldn't be fully complete until 1955, almost 20 years after she was initially laid down. While she was really fully capable of combat before that, it is still telling that it took that long for the French to fully complete her, between starts and stops and repeated sea trials to test equipment. Even more telling, Jean Bart would only have one more operation of note. She supported French forces during the Suez Crisis, with only one turret operational, this time her much-delayed super-firing turret. This was down to only carrying about half of a proper wartime crew, which also left her with only half of those fancy new anti-aircraft guns actually operational. While she would fire a single salvo of 4 shells on Egyptian forces, the French ended up canceling their landing, and Jean Bart returned to training duties. The last time she would sail was in July 1957, which was also the last time she fired her main guns. After this, she entered into reserve. That was 20 years of work to get her to a fully complete state, for all of 2 years in proper service. Understandably, quite a few in naval command were rather annoyed by this, considering how much money, blood, and tears had been spent on this ship. As it was, France simply didn't have enough men or money to keep Jean Bart in service, and they made the reasonable choice to keep more modern and capable destroyers and cruisers around. And, for that matter, the new French aircraft carriers soon to enter service. While there were attempts to refit her further, including more work to her already large anti-aircraft battery, these went nowhere. Even wacky ideas like replacing her main battery with missiles. 352 missiles to be exact. Arsenal ships Jean Bart? Anyway, none of those went anywhere. Jean Bart was set in port until 1970, at which point she was towed off for scrap. She lasted an impressively long time for how little actual service she saw. It's a shame that the last battleship completed ended up with such an unfortunate end. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and I'll see you in the next one.